Today, we are mastering the sales comparison approach for the national portion of the real estate exam, which is the most common appraisal method for residential properties and land. This approach relies heavily on the principle of substitution, meaning a buyer will not pay more for a property than the cost of acquiring an equally desirable substitute. When you see this on the exam, you must remember the golden rule, which is that we never adjust the subject property. The subject property is the benchmark and stays fixed while we make adjustments to the sales prices of the comparable properties to make them look like the subject. If you find a comparable property that is superior to your subject, you subtract value from that comparable's sales price. Conversely, if the comparable is inferior to your subject, you add value to that comparable sales price. A helpful mnemonic to keep this straight during the high pressure of the exam is CIA and CBS. CIA stands for comparable inferior add, and CBS stands for comparable better subtract. Let's look at a concrete example, because the exam will often give you a table of features and ask for the adjusted value. Suppose your subject property has a swimming pool, but the comparable property does not. Since the comparable is inferior because it lacks the pool, you add the estimated value of a pool to the comparable sale price. If the pool is worth $20,000 and the house sold for $400,000, you adjust the comparable up to $420,000. On the flip side, if the comparable has an extra half bathroom that your subject lacks, you subtract the value of that half bathroom from the comparable. Exam writers love to trick you by including a feature in the subject and asking you to calculate its value. But you must always apply that value to the comparable properties instead. Another common trap involves the sequence of adjustments. Usually, you adjust for financing concessions and market conditions first, then move to physical characteristics like square footage or condition. You might also be asked which comparable is the best indicator of value. The answer is always the property that requires the fewest and smallest adjustments. A property that needs 10 minor adjustments is generally less reliable than one that needs 2 major adjustments, because every adjustment introduces a margin for error. In an active residential market, this approach is considered the most reliable because it reflects the actual behavior of buyers and sellers in the current environment. You should also watch out for terminology changes, as this method is sometimes referred to as the market data approach. If you see a question about a specialized property like a post office or a church, remember that the sales comparison approach might not be the best fit because those properties do not sell frequently enough to provide reliable data points. Stick to using this for single-family homes and vacant land where similar sales are plentiful. When reconciling the different adjusted values of several comparables, do not simply take an average. Instead, an appraiser assigns more weight to the comparable that is most similar to the subject. If the exam asks how to finalize the value, look for the answer that mentions weighted averages or professional judgment, rather than a simple mathematical mean. Mastering these adjustments and the underlying logic of substitution will ensure you pick up every available point on appraisal questions. For the national exam, you need to be prepared for math problems where you calculate the final estimated value by applying these adjustments across 3 different properties. Remember that if a comparable sold under duress, such as a foreclosure or a sale between family members, it might not represent an arm's-length transaction and should be excluded from your calculation. An arm's-length transaction assumes both parties are well-informed and acting in their own best interest without undue pressure. If the exam presents a scenario where a house sold for significantly less because the seller was moving out of the country tomorrow, that property is a poor comparable because it does not reflect true market value. Focus on properties with similar square footage within the same subdivision that have sold within the last 6 months for the most accurate results. By keeping the subject property stable and only modifying the comparables using the CIA and CBS rules, you will navigate the appraisal section of the national exam with total confidence.